You need a home, and he needed a wife and a mother for his children. Nothing about that sentence made sense until the night the rain found her, standing under a flickering street lamp with two battered suitcases and the kind of tired that sat in her jaw. Before anything else, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from. She had been small and damp and stubborn in a way that made strangers want to look away and friends want to fix her, but she had no friends left that night, only the cold rain and a refusal to ask for charity. The man who stopped his black car by the curb spoke with a voice that did not hint at mercy, but at terms and numbers and an urgency that sounded like a business meeting in a church. "You need a roof," he said without softness. "And I need a wife for the sake of appearances," he added flatly, as if offering a coat. She stared at him, her hair plastered to her forehead, one shoe missing, and a child's crayon drawing folded among the few papers in her bag. He waited until the traffic noise swallowed the last of the thunder, and then he closed his eyes for a second, a single human blink that suggested something else hid beneath the steel. She thought of the nights she had spent tracing the stars from the roof of a shelter and the promise she had made to herself never to beg. When she agreed, it was not because the offer felt like salvation, but because the alternative was unknown, and unknown had been cruel enough so far. The narrator remembered that this was the moment the story promised a collision between two lives that could either mend or shatter each other. It began on that wet street, and it began with terms written not in ink but in the careful distance of a man who had lost a softness long ago. And that was how the house opened its door to her. The mansion smelled of old wood and lemons and a faint citrus cleaner that tried to pretend the hum of the central heating was silence. The foyer swallowed the sound of rain and revealed two small pairs of sneakers by the grand staircase and a woman with a headset who watched with a professional blink. The housekeeper Rosa introduced herself in a low, practical voice and led the newcomer past portraits that watched like judges. "This is Maya," Rosa said. "Mr. Ethan Mercer will hear what you have to say." Ethan Mercer was a headline and a rumor folded into a person. He was tall, clean-cut, and his clothes cost as much as some months of rent. He watched her with a guarded curiosity that looked almost like pity. Lily and Noah appeared like bright interruptions, Lily with curls like springs, and Noah with a gap in his front teeth that became a grin. At the sight of a new body in their routine, the first exchanges felt like questions and answers written in the margins of an unfamiliar script. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, standing at the edge of the marble hall, his voice even. "I am fine," she said quickly, which was both true and a lie. "Why are you here?" he asked, as if his house had logic and he had no place for chaos. "I had nowhere else," she answered, the rain making a track of wet on the sleeve of her jacket. "We have a clause," he said, pointing to an assistant who handed over an envelope thicker than it needed to be. "It is temporary," the assistant added. 3 months, Ethan explained. "A contractual marriage for image and stability while my name is under scrutiny," he finished, in a tone that did not ask for sympathy. Maya opened the envelope because sometimes survival required reading terms aloud. The letters smelled faintly of a law firm and coffee. "No parental rights," one line read. "Residency in the East Wing," another said. There was an odd simplicity to the arrangement that made it easier to breathe and harder to sleep. Lena, the nanny, watched them carefully. David, the house lawyer, cleared his throat twice instead of once, and the youngest, Lily, offered Maya an orange gummy from her pocket like a peace treaty. In the first hours, the mansion felt like a stage, and Maya felt like an understudy who had been tossed into the main role. She learned the timing of the electric kettle, the way a refugee learns the sound of a friendly city, and she learned the way trust arrived in small currencies, a hand held too long, a bowl of soup left steaming on the counter. The second morning, the children tested her with a song and a morning routine, and she fumbled pancakes into shapes that looked like modern art but tasted like love. The presence of kids softened Ethan in moments that surprised even his closest advisors. He kept a private studio off the library where he retreated and did not want intrusions, so when Lily ran in with flour on her nose, he did not slam the door. He lifted his head, and for a second, his face became a map of regret and something like hope. "You cook well," he said finally, as if making a measurement. She laughed a little, which surprised everyone. The house in daylight was different. The light through the high windows turned dust into gold, and the expensive silence into something like safety. Maya began to learn the routes between rooms, the names of the houseplants, and where the children kept their secret stash of toy cars. The camera bumped into their lives when the nanny posted a small, unremarkable video of Noah trying to toss a pancake into the air and missing, and the internet did the rest. The clip was innocent, and then it was everywhere with captions that called her the downstairs miracle and the anonymous caretaker who made kids smile. That accidental viral moment became a tiny key opening doors she had not wanted to open. Newsrooms sniffed, tabloids whispered, and that whisper grew into a current that pulled at Ethan like a bad wind. The arrangement was supposed to be practical and distant, but affection spread in the smallest of things: a hand on a forehead, a shared blanket, a bedtime story where Ethan tried and failed to do voices, and Lily insisted he was terrible but loved it anyway. The routine formed its own music, a breakfast rhythm, a school run with sandwiches cut in dinosaur shapes, and quiet nights when Maya read while Ethan reviewed documents with a frown so deep it looked carved. He rarely touched his children in public. He worried about optics and precedent, but in the privacy of the library, his eyes softened, and the boys clambered onto old leather chairs, making nests for themselves. Maya's past had given her a muscle for small miracles, and she spent it repairing the trivial things in the household that no one else noticed. She washed a favorite stuffed bear until it smelled like childhood again, and used a slow, careful patience to teach Noah to tie his shoes. The world outside pulsed with its own hunger, and within the house there were beginnings. The new life was not without humor. Pancakes stuck to the ceiling, and a blender became an impromptu confetti machine. And the chef of the estate took bets with Rosa about who would set off the fire alarm next. Those jokes were breaths in the larger narrative. But outside, the ex-fiancée Claire, a woman with a reputation like a well-honed rumor and a social calendar, watched from across the city with a smile that never touched her eyes. She called reporters with a practiced sigh and slipped hints into a column that suggested impropriety, and the gaze of the public landed like cold rain upon the arrangement. The first serious test arrived when Ethan invited friends to a fundraiser, and Claire arrived like a blade of ice in a garden. The dinner scene required conversation that was precise like surgery, and yet the heart had its own stubborn pulse. The main conversation that night between Maya and Ethan spooled out in careful exchanges and left impressions as vivid as stains on a tablecloth. "You cannot pretend forever," Claire said, with a smile that was an accusation. "We are not pretending," Ethan answered bluntly. "Then what are you?" Claire replied, leaning in as if to see the seams. "We are figuring it out," Maya whispered, a statement and a vow. In the middle of the meal, Lily crawled into Ethan's lap and pressed a crayon in his hand, and he kissed her forehead like it erased the world for a moment, and cameras found that single frame and decided it was a story. The kiss foreshadowed a turn, and it became one of the viral moments that defined the arc. The restaurant lights had been chosen to flatter, and the music was polite, and the camera phones were ready. And what happened in the middle of a polite silence was a small rebellion that felt like truth. Delivering the emotion on that night required a sequence of dialogues between the principal players that stretched into the kind of intimacy only forced proximity can build. "Stop taking everything so seriously," Maya told him later in private. "I am not sure how," he replied. "Start with a cup of coffee," she said, and he did. Their lines coiled around each other like cords, and in 8 exchanges that night, they moved from distance to a near confession, each reply a step closer. The sound of the city below felt muffled, and the chandelier above them listened in marble patience. Sensors of the house recorded movement, and the press took fragments and made a story of the rest. The next morning, the headline felt like frost on the windows of their life, and an email from a national journalist arrived with a subject titled, "Exclusive." Sarah from the Daily Ledger called with a voice that smelled like expectation. "Is this a publicity stunt?" she asked sharp. "It is not," Ethan replied. "Why should we believe you?" Sarah pushed. "Because my children sleep safer," he answered, and each word carried the weight of a man who had decided to use honesty as a shield. That was the beginning of the leak. A PR assistant named Julia had sent private photos to a friend, and a friend had been careless, and the story leaked like water finding a crack. Social media compiled the narrative into a tidy villain versus heroine scenario, and the press turned it into a cancel carousel. The coverage ramped up with opinion columns and morning show teasers. The law firm fielded calls, and investors asked questions, and sponsors made discreet inquiries. The legal team crafted a statement, and David, the house lawyer, edited every sentence for liability. For the formal record, the terms of the agreement were dry but revealing. Temporary domestic partnership for the purpose of familial stability in public arenas was a mouthful, and the clause that allowed termination on short notice if reputational harm occurred looked like an exit ramp drawn with precision. The press called it a fake marriage, the tabloids called it a sham, and online commentators called for boycotts, which translated into canceled panels and retracted sponsorships. The internet had many tongues, and few of them were gentle. The crescendo of public condemnation culminated in a live stream where an influencer dug into the story and suggested that Maya had manufactured the whole thing for fame. That accusation hurt, and it hurt almost as much as the fact that some of the people watching swallowed the suggestion like bread. Maya left with her suitcase, the same pair of shoes missing again. And no umbrella. But she left, unlike the night in the storm. She walked out with a dignity that was a new garment. The goodbye at the door was not cinematic. It was practical and dense with unspoken things. "You promised to protect them," Lily said, holding onto Maya's sleeve. "I will," Maya answered, and she meant it. "Come back," Ethan said softly, which sounded like a request and a command, and he instantly hated that it had sounded needy. The fallout after the leak was a series of phone calls, a network of legal advice, and a parade of friends who offered platitudes and costs, and sometimes the kindness of Rosa, who left a basket of bread on Maya's step. The crisis was a cliff, and everyone who loved them stood at the edge and wondered if the other would jump. Ethan sat in his studio and pinned photographs to a board, each image an attempt to understand how he had become a man who measured life in headlines. The backstory that explains his coldness unfolded in the slow, patient way of someone telling a confession into a mirror. When he was a boy, his father had taught him how to fix things, but not how to forgive the man who left the family fortune in tatters. He was taught that mistakes could cost everything, and that softness invited predators. He rose into adulthood building walls with businesses and contracts that could be counted. He learned to numb grief with work, and the result was a man who could not accept weakness in himself or others. As a young adult, he loved once, and it ended with betrayal, and the affair was public, and the shame taught him to put armor over everything. In his studio, he kept a photograph of a woman who had been the closest thing to a home, and the edges of that photo were worn like a moral geography. Those memories explained the fortress, but did not excuse the loneliness, and in that loneliness he collected anger. Maya's backstory was a different weather pattern entirely, and it took shape in 3 quiet memories that she carried like small stones in her pocket. Born in a small town, she had been taught to appreciate hands more than promises. Her mother had run a laundromat and used patience as a business model. Maya studied by little window lights and took night shifts waiting tables to pay for a course that she never finished because life required her presence elsewhere. She learned how to make small people feel known, because as a teenager she had kept a neighbor's child while the mother worked late, and that made her feel both useful and wanted. The loss that bent her life came the night the laundromat burned, and with it a history of receipts and photographs and a place where she had been loved. After that, she learned to move light belongings and lighter expectations. Each paragraph of her memory was a compact landscape of what molded her, the city of her childhood, the smallness of insufficient funds, and the expansion of her capacity to give. Those stories were not told as pity, but as context for why a woman could accept an impossible contract and still hold kindness like a small coin. She had friends who were named and who showed up in the narrative. Rosa, the housekeeper, who smelled like cinnamon and patience. David, the lawyer, with a habit of tapping a fountain pen when he was nervous. Sarah, the journalist, who looked for truth like a miner. Julia, the PR assistant, who made mistakes that cost other people sleep. Claire, the ex-fiance, who kept every event logged and punctuated. Mr. Bennett, the elderly neighbor who brought lemon scones and opinions. And a therapist named Hannah, who had a practice 3 blocks away and a way of asking questions that made people honest. They acted and reacted around the protagonists like constellations. The middle of the story needed to invite you into a participatory moment, so here is a pause to ask if you were in Maya's position, what would you do? Would you accept the arrangement or walk away? Comment below telling your city and say, I would save her, or I would refuse. If you think your voice matters here, the best comments might be featured in a future episode, and your perspective could help someone else decide. Now back to the story. After Maya left the house, Ethan realized that the thing he had protected all this time was not his reputation, but the children who had started to find life less alarming with her presence. He felt a lonely clarity that was dangerous and precise. He began to refuse meetings that involved his PR circle, and instead he spent time in the schoolyard watching Lily learn to ride a bike, and found that the sight of a child wobbling with fear and triumph rearranged something in him. He hired Hannah, the therapist, for family sessions, and the first minutes were awkward with silence. But the ending of that first hour left him more willing to speak. Meanwhile, Maya struggled to rebuild what she had almost let crumble again. She took a job at a neighborhood bakery and kneaded dough with the rhythm of someone making something live. She learned how to count until her pay matched a small apartment. And she volunteered to help at a community center. The public appetite for scandal moved on to other feasts, but the damage lingered in the quiet places where fewer people looked. The second major blow came when Claire organized an intervention of sorts at a gala and leaked a private letter from Ethan to a contact at a magazine. The letter read like a confession, and it landed like a stone. That act forced all of them into decisions, and Ethan folded against the force and made hasty defensive moves. The moment of public shame and the reactions to it were described in painstaking detail in court filings and PR transcripts, and the audience found its outrage again. The house emptied of easy routine, and the nights were long. The book of the story called the incident a rupture, and the rupture needed time to settle. During the fallow months that followed, Ethan wrote emails he deleted and practiced admitting guilt in front of a mirror. He came to understand that contracts could not bind what people felt, and that his behavior had pushed goodness away. Maya, in her small apartment, kept a crayon drawing on the wall as proof that the children had existed in her life, and she counted small mercies like beads. The search for reconciliation did not happen in a single spectacular act. It occurred in tiny, brave steps and in a decided pursuit. The reenactment began at a coffee shop that smelled of bitter beans and cinnamon, and which belonged to a man named Mr. Bennett, who had become an agent of small kindnesses in the neighborhood. Maya sat with a book and a coffee that had cooled because the nerves of facing Ethan made time bend. He walked in with the exhaustion of someone who had wrestled with his conscience and found the courage to be ordinary. They spoke in a public place where strangers overheard, and yet in that hum of refrigerators and cups there was privacy. Their dialogue that afternoon unfolded in multiple exchanges, 8 to 10 in number, each line sharpening into honesty. "Why did you leave?" he asked, like a child looking for rules. "Because I needed to know if this was because of me or because of them," she replied. "It was partly my cowardice and partly my fear," he said. "Can fear be excused?" she asked. "Not without work," he answered, and then added, "I want to work," which was not a demand, but a petition. The old refrain of programmatic reserve broke down into small sentences that made a path. That cafe moment became the site of the third required public moment, the request for a real life, not a contract. It was not mere spectacle, it was a plea and a performance of vulnerability in front of the world. The scene was roughly 550 characters of compressed longing and was broadcast indirectly because a neighbor recognized them and posted a photo. The reactions were split into pity and joy, and the world once again turned to look. The reconciliation asked for legal clarity, and Ethan requested David to draft a formal renunciation of the temporary clause in the original agreement. The clause was crossed out in a meeting with witnesses, and the language changed from temporary to permanent to domestic partnership with guardianship revisions and simple human phrasing that removed the cold calculus of reputational clauses. A short procedural note explained how the contract was rescinded through amendment signed by both parties in presence of a notary. And an image of the signature became an anchor for those who needed proof. The return was not uncomplicated. There were sequences of tension, two of which slowed the narrative into moments where memory and decision coiled together, and those passages took the length of half a page each and lingered on smell, sounds, and the weight of history. In one tense instant, Claire sued for custody claims she did not truly pursue, but the threat forced Ethan to confront the public's appetite for drama. In a second tense moment, a journalist named Sarah accused Maya of opportunism in a primetime slot, and the community responded with a flood of support and donations to a shelter that had once housed Maya. The scenes of tension were deliberate and stretched for 500 to 600 characters, showing internal deliberation and the risk of losing what had been earned. Friends like Rosa and neighbors like Mr. Bennett and a baker named Carlos showed up to testify about Maya's character, and the little network of people who mattered became visible. The redemption arc required more than confession, it required action. Ethan began to carve out time from his company. He announced a new foundation that supported single parents and small community projects, and in a quiet where the announcement did not thunder, he and Maya planted a small garden in the backyard and watched bulbs turn into color. The public gesture of the foundation was described in process terms that were credible. The legal registration was filed, and the first grant was evaluated by a committee including Rosa and Hannah. The grant cycle included transparency reporting, and the Foundation's charter emphasized community work and support for caretaker roles. The gesture achieved its intended effect, more on people who needed help than on the stock price. In the weeks that followed, the real work was domestic. The children learned to see their life as less precarious and more rhythmic. There were ordinary scenes. Noah falling asleep on the couch mid-cartoon with a bowl of popcorn on his chest. Lily drawing a family portrait that included both women because she thought mothers came in more than one shape. Ethan learning that he liked to cook even if he burned the first attempts, and Rosa laughing and shaking her head. The narrative that relocated from scandal to small steady kindness moved the crowd away from outrage to curiosity and then to acceptance. The book of the story closed with preparations for a modest wedding that would be both a private vow and a public symbol. The ceremony was not ostentatious, it was full of human detail, the sort of detail the audience loved. Pancakes made into hearts, the recipe that Noah insisted on. The guest list that included quiet allies such as Julia and David, and loud supporters like Mr. Bennett, who brought scones. The moment of the vow was filmed by a neighbor's camera, and the clip became a final viral thing. But this time it felt earned, because it had been paid for by months of work, an apology, and the slow building of trust. The epilogue described their new life in 3 time markers, 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the wedding, and it stretched for roughly 2,200 characters to show concrete transformation. 1 month later, they were a family, in the literal sense. The children had new routines. Maya worked part-time, both at a community center and as a liaison for the foundation. Ethan took paternity leave, and he was awkward and earnest, and it fit him, like a garment that had to be learned. The house had new artworks on the walls. Lily had painted a mural of a sun, and a line of shoes by the door spoke of comings and goings. 3 months after the wedding, they had better sleep schedules. Noah had a small role in a school play, and Ethan attended parent-teacher nights without checking his phone for shareholders' updates in the corner. The foundation had distributed its first small grants to the neighborhood bakery and a shelter that Rosa recommended. And the press had mostly shifted to other stories, leaving behind a calmer hush of acceptance. 6 months later, they had expanded their routines. A garden had produced tomatoes, a small black and white dog named Button joined the household, and the family had a simple Sunday market tradition where Maya and Ethan bought flowers together, and they argued about what to make for dinner as if they had nothing more important to worry about than seasoning. The epilogue included names and gestures that proved the change had teeth. Hannah, the therapist, kept occasional sessions, and the kids were enrolled in a music class run by a neighbor named Carlos who taught rhythms and patience. The final paragraph of the story rewound briefly to remind the audience that contracts could be torn up, but forgiveness required labor and a willingness to be seen flawed and trying, and then concluded with a single sentence that had the weight of a small anthem. Do not assume that chance encounters are nothing, because sometimes they build a home. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow more full narratives of second chances and family rebuilt. And if you have thoughts, share them below, because your comment may live on as someone else's guide.